So in any event, let's get started. Let's start talking about, what's required to make teamwork work. It's definitely not as easy as you might think. And in fact, one of the things we're famous for saying at Chingu is that it's the soft skills part of a project that are much harder than the technical aspects. If there's a library or a framework or a database that you haven't learned yet, or maybe a part of any of those technical aspects that you aren't familiar with, it's relatively straightforward to pick that knowledge up. You can do a quick internet search and you can get links to videos and articles and Discord channels. You have people you can ask. Those things are relatively fast to pick up. But the soft skills are much, much harder. And one of the reasons is that humans are the most complex machines, that there are. Every one of us is unique and different. We have different experiences that influence, how we respond to situations. And because of that, that's what makes soft skills, just so complex. So let me, hopefully you can see I'm not presenting my screen, am I? Let me
Not
fix
really.
that. We're going to fix that. All right, hopefully you can see it now. Thank you, Andres. Yeah, so let's talk about what are the attributes that really define what is a good teammate. So first and foremost is good teammates are respectful and they're professional. Respect is the foundation of trust, and you're going to hear us say this over and over and over again in this presentation that trust is really the cornerstone of a good team. If you don't have trust, everything depends on it. So it's going to be very difficult to have a productive team and a happy team if you don't establish trust. The next thing that's important is daily communication and collaboration. Now, one of the things we used to say in Chingu, we used to give advice that said, well, share your voyage status with your teammates every 2 or 3 days. And we've tightened up on that. We now really strongly ask that Voyagers post their status daily. And we have that /stand-up command you can use in your team channel to make it a little bit easier to share status. Now, the reason we did that is what we found is that it's too easy to forget to share your status if you're only doing it every few days. So what this is intended to do is to essentially build a really good habit and to make the sharing of status a habit as opposed to a task or a routine task. And in fact, if you're on the job, if you're at a company that's really practicing Scrum as it should be practiced, you'll have a daily stand-up meeting. It's only going to be about 15 minutes to go around the room and find out, what have your teammates completed? What are they working on now? And do they have any blockers? Those are the 3 questions to share in any daily status. So that's fairly quick, but you'll find that in companies, that's a daily occurrence. Something that's absolutely huge and something that we struggle with, quite frankly, at Chingu is that a good teammate completes their commitments. And what that means is in your sprint planning session, when you volunteer to work on a task, you should be sharing with your team what's the expected, deadline for that. When do you think you're going to be able to complete that task? Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be down to the exact day. It could be something as simple as yeah, I'm going to do this task, and I don't see any issues at this point in time with completing it in this sprint. Um, and the reason that is a bit imprecise, during the sprint planning meeting, is until you actually start examining the task at a detail level, you don't know all of the facts that's going to influence how fast you can complete it. And that's really part of Scrum. At Scrum, when we create our product backlog in the first or second sprint of a project, it's a very general outline of what we want to build. You don't know the details until you actually start working on the task. And that's the point in time where you're doing detailed design, coding, testing, and so on. Now, it is entirely possible, and in fact, it happens frequently, that as part of that detailed design that you do, you'll find uh, complications in the task that you didn't know during sprint planning, and that you certainly didn't know when you created your product backlog. Uh, what's important isn't that, oh, on Monday, I told the team I could complete this in this sprint, and now I've discovered it's going to take two sprints. What matters is that you let your team know when there's a change. So that's, again, all part of this daily communication and collaboration. So when you find that you can't complete a commitment, you need to let everyone on your team know that what the update is or what the status is. Now, again, quite honestly, at Chingu, one of the issues we have is because we're essentially a free service, people join and then there are people that drop out in a voyage. Uh, and so this completing commitments is very important to us. It's also very disruptive if you join a voyage and you drop out. So before you sign up for a voyage, you should look at the voyage section of the handbook. And in it, there is a question that we've posed that says, essentially what's required? What's my time commitment? So you should take a look at that and understand, what is your commitment when you sign up for a voyage? Now, being an open and frank communicator, that's also something that's an attribute of a good teammate. This doesn't mean that you're disrespectful in any way. It means essentially that you're very honest in your communication. If Dinesh and I are on a team and I find a problem, and let's say it's Dinesh has a PR he's created and I'm reviewing it and I see a problem in the code, I'm going to point that out. I'm going to post a comment in the PR that says something to the effect of hey, Dinesh, I'm looking at this and I see this problem. I'm going to ask him, what does he think about this? And I'm going to be very detailed with the facts. And that's really important. I'm not going to introduce any kind of emotional response. I'm going to stick to the facts of, hey, this seems to be a problem, and here's why I think it's a problem. And then I'm going to enlist him as a partner in correcting that. So that's part of being frank. So again, being a frank communicator doesn't mean you're not respectful and professional. It just means you're very honest. Another thing that's important in teammates is that you have to adapt to changing conditions. In this example we talked about a few minutes ago, where we start working on a task in a given sprint, and when we're doing that detailed design, we find that there are complications. There's things we didn't know about this task when we added it to the backlog back in sprint 2 that we now understand and have discovered. So we're going to adapt to that. And again, that means we're going to share that knowledge with our team. It's a good idea to actually update the backlog item to document, what is it that I've found that we didn't know before? What's complicating this particular task, and how do I intend to handle it? But rather than complaining about it, I'm going to adapt to it. Now, this gets important out in a real job because I guarantee you, every single project you work on where there's an end user involved, you're going to be halfway through the voyage, and the user community is going to speak up in a meeting or send an email or whatever and say, "Oh, guess what? We've had a governmental regulation change that's altered our primary objective in this project, and you're going to have to adapt to it." Rather than complaining about it, you just need to accept that change is going to occur. And that's one of the strengths of Agile and Scrum. In Waterfall, which was an older project management kind of methodology, you did all of your design, 100% of the design up front. And it made it very difficult to change the application, as it was being developed, when you do that. And in fact, many waterfall frameworks, they actually resist change. They have very complicated, change management and approval procedures that on the surface, they may sound like they're really good auditing techniques, but one of their purposes is actually to resist change. And Scrum doesn't do that. With Scrum, we adapt to change. Another thing that a really good teammate does is they're very, very willing and actually very they believe in sharing what they learn. One of the things that makes teams so strong is you tend to learn from your teammates when you're sharing information. Now you have to be careful about the level of detail, but that you're doing. I mean, you don't want to post like a book or write a book in a team channel, but you can certainly post, "Hey, I learned this today," and ask the question. Does anyone want to learn more about the details of what I've discovered? The other part of this is not just like a push type of sharing, like I just described, but it's also sharing by volunteering to help teammates out when you see that they're working on a problem and they're struggling with it. One of the things that I always like to do in that situation is ask a question of my teammate. Something like, "Hey, I see that you've reported the same status on one of your tasks for 4 days in a row. Do you need any help?" Even if it's having someone that you can talk to about the problem, that can actually be very, very helpful. Because many times when we're working on a problem, if we're doing it by ourselves, inside of our head, we have a certain structure and certain assumptions that we build up about the problem. But when we share it with another person and when they're asking questions, we tend to see things in a different aspect. And it triggers new ideas and new thoughts and whatnot. So sharing, is really, it's like the superpower of a team in my mind. Another thing that's important, and again, this is really important in a Chingu voyage, but it's important in any project. You need to understand not just your role, but you need to understand how you interact with teammates in other roles. So using a voyage as an example, your team may have a product owner, a scrum master, a UI UX designer, and then developers. So you don't have to know the details of what a product owner or a scrum master does or a UI UX designer, but you should know in general, what are their responsibilities, and you need to think about what are these interaction points that I may have with someone in another role. So to take a good example, one of the assumptions that many Chingus make is that, oh, well, the UI UX designer is going to create that application wireframe in the first few sprints. And then they're not going to have anything else to do in the remainder of the voyage. Well, that's not true. While the majority of the UI UX designer's work is really focused towards the beginning of the project, as the project progresses, as a developer especially, you should be asking your UI UX designer to review your implementation of their design because they're going to find things. They may see things that maybe you implemented it, you didn't understand it, and you implemented it in a slightly different way. Or maybe as due to a bug fix, maybe the UI was changed, and it's now harder for the end user to understand what's required of them than it was in the original design. So maybe there's a modification that's needed. So your UI UX designer can help with that throughout the voyage. So again, all of these attributes, what they do is they build trust and confidence across the team. We've probably all been in teams where we've had teammates, we've had to second guess them, or we've avoided talking to them because they're not respectful or they're not professional. That takes time, and it takes emotional energy on the part of everyone, which the net result is it takes away from or it reduces your productivity. Let me put it that way. And it also creates a team atmosphere that's not necessarily pleasant. So you don't have to like everyone that's on your team, but you do need to be able to work with them in a professional way. So any questions or comments or thoughts before we move on? What we're going to do next is dive into the kind of how do you build these attributes. Okay. At any point, if you have questions or comments or disagreement, feel free to speak up or to post it in the chat channel. So for the remainder of this, let's talk about how do we accomplish this. So one of the first things is you want to create a safe environment. Now I'll tell you, it's my co-founder and I of Chingu. He's still a co-founder. He's just silent. He and I had a lot of actually downright difficult arguments over this term safe environment. He didn't like it, but I haven't found a phrase that works as well as safe environment. And what it really means is you're creating an environment, or your goal is to create a team environment where your teammates don't hesitate to contribute ideas or to ask questions or to point out problems. You and your teammates should know that you're not going to be attacked or made fun of because of something you've said. That's what a safe environment is. And as an example, I'm on Reddit every day, but Reddit is famous. Some of those groups on Reddit, they are famous for being hostile. Snowbite's supportive is part of this. But anyway, they're absolutely hostile. And what I've seen over the years is there are people in the different groups that hesitate to ask a question because they're anxious that the response that they're going to get is negative in some way. So again, respect is the key. Whenever someone asks a question or proposes an idea, you want to evaluate that question and idea from a viewpoint that, hey, my teammate is trying to make our product better. They're asking this for a reason. And yeah, they may have made a mistake. It may be something simple that they should know, but they don't, or they've forgotten. So my objective as a teammate is to let them know, answer the question. Yeah, here's what what the answer is, but keep it as a fact. Don't try to do any judgment. Again, we kind of touched on this, but you need to honor different opinions. Too many times we get very rigid in our own and invested too much in what we think is the right answer or the right way to do something. Uh, but that's not necessarily the case. And it's especially true in web development, where there are not hundreds, there are thousands of different libraries. There's God only knows how many different frameworks there are, ways of implementing a UI UX in the front end. And none of them are wrong, or I should say bad. They may not be the best solution for a particular use case, but um, just because I like, for example, let's say that I'm using Laravel, it doesn't mean that Laravel is the right answer in all cases. So you need to respect the suggestions and the comments that your teammates make, and give it some honest thought about, maybe they're right. Maybe my way of doing things isn't the best way for this particular use case. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Uh, Makawa, asking questions is really the best way of learning, or one of the best ways of learning. It's second, in my mind, it's second only to making a mistake. Now, to do this, to basically to honor a different opinion, you have to practice active listening. Now, too many times what I've seen and what I have done, I do myself. I have to work to catch myself all the time so that I don't do this. Too many times I may be quiet. I may be listening to the person's words, but what I'm doing is I'm thinking about, okay, how do I counter that? Let's say and I are talking about whether or not to use the Go language for a particular app. He may be talking about, here are the advantages, here's the reasons why. But what I'm doing in my mind is I'm thinking, okay, how do I build a case against that? Because I prefer some other language. Active listening is is not just being quiet and hearing the other person's words. It's processing what they're saying and doing an evaluation inside your head to ask questions about, well, is there anything that person may have missed? But also, is there something I may have missed? Is their solution the best one for the use case we're presented with, or for bug fix or whatever? So let's see. Nika said, I have a serious struggle with being diplomatic while being frank and productive. I like asking questions, but maybe I don't know how to ask them correctly. Well, that's actually a common problem that people fight. Um, One of the things I like to, well, we'll talk about it later in detail, but you always want to separate facts from your emotions. Basically, you want to think in a quantitative way rather than a qualitative way. Um, but I think more to the point, think about the amount of words that you're using and how you present uh, a topic. When you're being frank or you're proactive. Are you using too many words? And you want to filter it yourself before you share questions and before you point out issues? Is it very focused? Um, One of the problems in any development environment or any team environment is we really tend to use text channels a lot. Uh, but one of the problems is if we write too much, it obscures our main point. Um, the other thing, the more words you write, especially in English, the more words you write, the more they are subject to being misinterpreted in some way. So you want to be very concise. Personally, I like to write in bullets. And I tend to write it, and then I will read what I've written before I send it. And I'll evaluate it from the standpoint of, okay, if I'm a teammate who's reading this, you know, uh, how could I improve this to make it understood or more understandable? Uh, for example, am I throwing in facts or observations that really don't don't matter to the main point I'm trying to make? So there is this kind of filtering process and editing process you should do, um, or I would suggest that you do that can help with that. The other thing I like to do many times when I point out something to a teammate, I do this all the time with members of the Chingu admin team. We throw a lot of ideas back and forth in our admin channel. And we also report or share with one another problems we see. I tend to put at the end or close, with, what do you think? What's been your experience? So I kind of throw it back to them. And what that does is, again, that makes them a partner in finding a solution or answering a question rather than an adversary. We've talked about being honest and frank. That's actually a really good timing, Nika. You must be looking at the slides. Uh, I'm not going to go into that anymore. We've already talked about this one quite a bit. One of the other things is when you're listening, when someone is reporting, like let's say it's in a PR review, and someone is let's say Snowbites is reporting to me that they found a bug in the code that I've submitted. Well, I don't look at that as a criticism. I like to frame that in my head as that's a gift. That's really saving me a lot of time in the future. If this got out to the user community, it could impact users. It could be that the problem resolution is going to take longer. Not probably. Problem resolutions will take longer in production code than what they do if that problem is reported in a PR review. Um, so again, those are gifts. Likewise, if an end user is reporting something to you, like a part of the application that you've written that maybe is hard to use, kind of our natural reaction, because we have a lot of pride in our work, is we take exception to that. We interpret that as, again, like some type of attack. But in fact, it's a criticism. The end user and the development team, we all have the same goal, and that's to improve the application so that it delivers real value to the organization. Uh, so again, think of criticisms, bug reports, whatever, as gifts. Pardon me. This is just to reinforce this. We talked about it a few minutes ago, but think quantitatively, not qualitatively. So an example is if you, let's say you're evaluating your UI UX designer's wireframe. Rather than saying, oh, I think this is hard to use, tell them why. Exactly why is this form hard to use? It could be, I think that the label should be more descriptive and should be in terms that the users use every day. If let's say that on the form that the designers created, there's a field for account number. Well, if the end user always refers to that as a customer number, it's probably a good idea to use customer number as the label on that field rather than account number, because that's something that the end user understands. Another example is in the area of performance. Let's say that in a PR review, rather than saying, oh, well, when I tested this bit of code, this function, it was really slow. Well, rather than saying it's really slow, say, well, it took 3.5 seconds to complete, and we know that users tend to lose focus after about a second and a half. Is there a way that we can make this run faster? Can we get it down to 1.5 seconds or lower? Another example is if you're improving your website's SEO, you can use things like Google Analytics and other tools to point out that, oh, our average user who hits the site, they only stay on the site for 15 seconds. That means that they're not seeing anything that captures their attention. So they're going to the site and then they're exiting fairly quickly. Our goal is to try to keep their attention and get them to interact with the site. Let's see. One of our teammates created a really thorough issue with a bug label. It was super exciting. We learned not only about our architecture, but about the way browsers work in general. Yeah, that's a great example of not just being sharing information, but being more quantitative. Showing why. Why was that important? And again, like I said, learning something in the process. Yeah, I want to go back to something Snowbite said too. He said, "I'm guilty of using too many words." That's common among software engineering teams, and I do that myself. And in fact, hopefully today you're going to see a major upgrade to the void section of the handbook. We went through it and we edited every single word, and we tried to pick simpler words, shorter sentences. We tried to improve the text so that it's easier to understand. Uh, and so there's fewer words and there still are parts of the handbook are like a wall of words. So again, safety, the whole point of this is it breeds trust, and that's why it's important. A secondary reason is if you have an environment, a development team environment that's safe, you're going to be a lot happier as a member of that team. And it's been shown time and again that teams that are happy, they tend to be more productive. All right, let's talk about working agreements. One of the biggest problems I've seen in teams in general is you get down to, let's say sprint 4 or sprint 5 or sprint 15, and you find that some team members are working against one another. And it's not because they're bad team members or they're bad people. It's because they each had a different assumption about how to get the work done. So what a working agreement does is it establishes a baseline so that everyone on the team can understand, and agree on how are we going to work together. So some questions you might ask, these are actually just examples. Your team should look at this from the basis of what's important to your project and your team. But things like, is there a time when everyone should be available? Maybe we want to have an ad hoc, an unscheduled meeting. We just want to connect with teammates. Or maybe it's something like with availability, it's something like, what's the time of day that everyone needs to have their daily status submitted? That would save the team time, because if you review the status channel after that point in time, you know that everyone is posted to it. So you don't have to keep running back and forth to the status channel. We're going to dive into how to deal with conflict, specifically how to deal with conflict in a few more slides. But you want to think about, ahead of time, when a disagreement comes up, what are the steps you're going to take to resolve it? Now, in working agreements, your goal is not to write a book. Okay. You're basically think of these as bullets, and they're very, very high level. They describe how are you going to work together, not necessarily every detail. If you did that, you'd spend the whole project, you'd spend all of your sprints writing documentation rather than writing code. You also want to talk about how many meetings you're going to have and when are you going to hold them. It's always more efficient in any project to schedule meetings for a predictable day and time and make them repeating meetings. Uh, that way you schedule them one time because scheduling meetings and managing time, for some reason, you'd think that would be really simple, but it's one of the hardest things that we do as projects, or as remote teams, I should say, in projects. And every project I've worked on, remote project, this has been an issue. Now, in terms of how many meetings, one suggestion there is you can certainly combine different Scrum events into a single meeting time. There's nothing wrong with that at all because it is very difficult in a voyage to schedule. Uh, Sometimes it's hard to schedule one meeting for the team per week, let alone one for every Scrum event. However, those events are very, very important, and you should handle them in some way in each and every sprint. You want to think about, how are PRs to be reviewed and what's the time limit for PRs? If a PR is created, how quickly should the review start? One of the worst things I've seen in any team is PRs that take days and weeks to complete. Because the longer that a PR is unresolved, the higher the probability that someone on the team is going to get or going to experience a merge conflict. Plus, if a PR is hanging out there, it's not reviewed quickly. That means you're not delivering code to the end user or application functionality to the end user. What technical standards are you going to follow? This is your technical stack, but it's also could be things like some coding standards, maybe like naming conventions. The other thing to think about is what's the process for changing these technical standards? Um, I've been on a project for some time where we had a technical stack defined, and someone introduced a new part, a new component to that technical stack, and didn't share it with the rest of the team until it was essentially already implemented. And that's not very respectful to the rest of the team. And it was actually a major change. That's not very respectful, but it just soaks up a lot of time. And it can create bad will among team members. You want to think too about what are the metrics that are important to your team. And these aren't just application metrics. These could be metrics about things like what's the time interval, the average time interval between the time we create a new PR and that PR is closed. That's actually a really good metric to follow. Uh, we have some metrics that we're introducing in Chingu. You've seen us post them in the V54 announcements channel. We now collect from GitHub how many commits has each team member made to the main branch and to non-main branches, and how many commits have they made? I'm sorry, how many PRs have they created to the main branch and PRs created to other branches, I should say. And there are some more GitHub metrics we're going to be adding. And at some point, our goal is to share this in a dashboard. So at any point in time, teams can see the dashboard and compare what are they doing with other teams. And again, this isn't limited to just these. These are just examples. At the beginning of any project, it's important for your team to brainstorm, to think about what are the things that we need to be united on. What are the processes and procedures that we should all follow? So any questions or comments or disagreements? And again, for all of the documents we're talking about, uh, you don't want to try to write like a complete run book. You don't want to think in paragraphs. You want to think in bullets. These should be very concise and very short and very to the point. Oh, thanks, Makala. Yeah, and we aren't stopping with just this modification to the handbook. We're going to keep doing this for the next few voyages to try to make that handbook a lot simpler to read and understand. All right. The other thing that's important to teams, and this is a best practice, is 100% transparency. Every teammate should have access to the information they need to help them complete their tasks. And it's obvious the reason why. Uh, you don't want to withhold any information uh, so that, if I'm working on a task, I deliver it and it turns out it doesn't meet the requirements because I didn't know what all the requirements were, for example, or I didn't understand what all the edge cases were. Now, out in the real world, on a real job, you will encounter exceptions to this. Uh, one example I can think of from my history is a payroll application that dealt with executive payroll. Uh, Obviously, you have to have test data, but the executives, the CEO and board members and whatnot, the CFO, they did not want their exact, not so much their salary, but their bonus information known throughout the company. And so as a result, that information was hidden from the development team. They had to basically make their test data, they had to just guess at it. And they had to to use ranges that were very high and very low to make sure they wouldn't hit any edge cases once they went production. And one edge case that I can think of is there was an executive that uh, was paid $1 a year. That individual, their income came from 100% from their bonus. So that meant that the difference between the salary and the bonus was just very stark. It was just I don't remember what their bonus was. I never really knew it, but it could have been $10 million a year. So that's an example where it's valid to withhold some information. So you want to share all the documents. This includes team notes. This includes obviously the wireframe. If you're doing a working agreement, all of that. Your team should be creating agendas and having meeting notes added to them uh, for all of your meetings. Those should be shared across the team. Also, teams, there are cases where a product owner or a scrum master or even individual team members may meet with one another outside of the team channel to work on a specific problem, for example. But anything that deals with the team as a whole, any discussion should be carried out with the whole team. No one should be excluded. And the reason for that is everyone should be able to contribute, ideas and suggestions and criticisms to these discussions that matter to the team. Yeah, that's very true, Doris. If you look at Scrum values and whatnot, that's definitely in there. And again, like with all of these things we're talking about, transparency requires trust. And trust is what you're trying to build in any team. And it works the other way too. This is reflexive. Transparency not only requires trust, it can build trust as well. Because if you're in a team where you know that no one's hiding anything from you, you're going to be uh, you're going to be more willing to contribute. Uh, but you're not going to build up any bad feelings because you think someone is talking about you, for example, talking about you behind your back. So, any questions or thoughts? Or okay, we'll move on. Again, at any point, feel free to speak up. This is my view and based on my experience. And a lot of this is based on Scrum as well, specifically. But, there are other viewpoints, and you may have other techniques you've used that you found to be very valuable. So this is related to the working agreement, but every team experiences some type of risk. Okay. What for the easiest way to express this is what could go wrong in this application or this project. So it's good, especially with more complex projects, to think about what could go wrong and to build an outline plan for, okay, what are we going to do if this risk is actually realized? So companies do this all the time. Things like what if tariffs are increased against our company? So the cost of our product that we're trying to sell to customers goes up. How do we handle that? Is it a simple we increase the price of the goods that we're trying to sell, or do we try to absorb that for a period of time? Or do we spread it out some other way? So the whole point of building these risk plans is to reduce time and also to reduce the impact of the risk by defining how are we going to handle them. The whole point of that first bullet is it takes time to determine how are we going to handle a problem. Well, if you can do that at the beginning of the project and do it in a general way, you're creating essentially kind of a roadmap for how do we fix this problem if it happens. You're going to save time when that issue actually occurs. Again, you're saving time, you're saving confusion or eliminating confusion, and you're also eliminating or reducing conflict as well. Because when problems occur, everyone's kind of emotional level goes into overdrive. Let's say there's a huge bug discovered in the application. Well, we go into panic mode. And so it makes it harder to try to define how to fix the situation if we haven't thought about it before. Again, you want to be very, very clear and concise, very short in terms of how you define what you're going to do. You want to think about writing an outline versus a book or even a pamphlet. And again, the whole point of this, you're thinking about what can go wrong. And if it does go wrong, what are we going to do about it? So let's go into a specific example of uh, team conflict. Every team has some conflict at some point in time. Now, it could be minor. Hopefully, it's minor, but it could be something very serious. So, what would our risk plan look like for how we address conflict? Well, there's three parts to this. So, the things that we would do to try to prevent conflict is we want to really, before anything happens, before a project really gets started, we want to define what's the expectations that everyone should have. So we want to define how are we going to deal with the conflict, But we also want to take time in the team to really understand each other's personality and work habits. And the reason for that is if you understand your teammate, then if you have some disagreement with them, you're better equipped. You're better able to respond to them or to respond to the situation in a way that reduces the temperature of the problem and makes it quicker to resolve. Now, during some type of disagreement, the things you want to do. And again, this is the roadmap for what we would do if the conflict occurred. Well, the first thing is we want to quickly identify it, and we don't want to procrastinate. We don't want to say things like, well, yeah, we know that one half of the team is in a serious disagreement with the other half of the team, but let's put this off until the next meeting. You know, no, the quicker you deal with it, the quicker it's going to be to resolve it. The other thing to do and to agree on, this is an expectation everyone should have on the team, is leave your ego at the door. Many times our egos make stressful situations even more stressful because we're not willing to compromise or to even look for a solution. So many times our ego creates this sense of I'm right and you are wrong. Well, things are rarely that simple. Okay, they're always more nuanced than that. So if you don't think about things and you don't react emotionally, it makes it easier to resolve. And it helps find the ultimate solution, the best solution, a lot faster. As we've seen over and over again, being respected and frank is important. Uh, if you're not respectful, that's just going to make a conflict or a disagreement, 100 times worse. The other thing you want to think about is think about the strengths of your teammates. If I'm in a conflict with someone, I want to think about, okay, why did this disagreement come about? And what's their motivation for their position? So I want to try to understand the other person a little bit better. And to do that, I need to be that active listener again. I need to forget for a moment what my position is or my solution is and really concentrate on what is the other person saying. And ultimately, what these do, these turn people from being adversaries into partners to find a solution. And again, we talked about this before as well, but separate that qualitative viewpoint from a quantitative viewpoint. Let's say that, well, let's go back to Andres and I disagreeing over what language to use. He wants to use Go and I want to use Node.js, JavaScript. Rather than he or I saying, oh, well, Go is just better, Go is newer. JavaScript is more people know JavaScript. It's better. Go is just too new. Reduce that down into pros and cons. And a pro, there may be something that's a pro on one side, maybe a con on something else. A pro of JavaScript, it's established, well known. A con on the Go side is it's relatively new. It's been around, I think, 5 years or so, which is that's a long time, but long time in the web world anyway. But if you make this pro and con list, it'll hopefully be easier to sort out. And if you do it together, again, you're creating a partnership to find an answer or solution, not not keeping as just an argument. And obviously, you'd want to admit in this particular Example, you'd want to omit anything that Nika and Andre says. I'm just kidding because they're Go people. And then finally, once you've arrived at a solution, you've implemented it, you want to reflect on it as a team. You want to look at or think about, okay, why did it start? And what escalated? What made it into, yeah, thank you, Dinesh. What made it such a serious issue? And the whole point about for both of these questions is then you can look at your team processes and your working agreement, and you can see, do they need to be adjusted in some way to help prevent this from occurring in the future? Or at least maybe it might occur, but the impact would be less. And then what do we learn from it? It's not just that about solving the problem, or resolving the disagreement. It's, are there valuable things that we learn from it that we could use in future sprints? So this all becomes part of continuous improvement. Yeah, always listen to Andres and Nika. So any questions, thoughts, anything anyone wants to share about this? Now for these are called risk mitigation. That's the formal term around this. Again, in a voyage, you don't have to invest a lot of time in this. And you shouldn't invest a lot of time because you've only got 6 weeks for the voyage. Out on the job, you'll want to spend a little more time thinking about this, and you'll want to build up fairly extensive, risk assessment and risk remediation uh, procedures. Things like, what happens if the end user comes up with a new hard requirement, in the middle of the project, or what happens if our lead developer quits, things like that. So again, questions, thoughts, anything anyone wants to share? Okay. The next one is follow Scrum. Many times what I've seen, both in Chingu and outside Chingu, when companies get close to a deadline, that increases some stress on everyone, on all stakeholders. They tend to start scrimping or not following Scrum like they should. And that is bad, because what happens is Scrum is the process that helps you get things done. And if you stop following Scrum, you start, not attending sprint planning sessions, or not doing, maybe your team omits your sprint review altogether. That basically makes it harder to reach the deadline rather than easier. So Scrum is an investment you're making. It's not a cost. So for voyages, read about Scrum in the handbook. I hope this shows, but if you go down to the voyage section of the handbook, and specifically in sprint 3 through 5 discussion, this basically describes the Scrum process for Chingu. We have intentionally implemented a minimal version of Scrum because we know that so many Chingus, this is your first exposure to Scrum. And even if you know about Scrum, it's your first time that you're actually using it in a team project. So this tells you what you need to know about Scrum, and it's worth a read. It's not that long. It's worth reading about this to understand, what are the expectations and what are the requirements that you should follow to follow Scrum in your voyage project. The second thing, as Doris implied earlier, is to practice your Scrum values. If we look at those, these are part of Scrum. So it's courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness. It's a lot of the things we've talked about, but you should read this. This isn't long either, and they are important to any project. They will help you to get things done with the minimal amount of disruption. So I'll let you read that. There's a lot here, a lot of links as well. Just as an aside, scrum.org, that's the website that has all of the most current Scrum information. So I'd suggest that don't read the whole site, but you should know that that's available as a resource. Let's see. Snowbite says Agile MBA. Yeah, it is still a thing. Chingu is we don't have like a financial partnership with the job hackers. We are essentially friends, but they promote Chingu in their organization, and we promote the job hackers in ours. They have a free class called the Agile MBA that runs for 6 or 8 weeks. They offer it 4 times a year. It gives you a good background, not just on Agile, but about real companies and how things work and all those interactions between people and how you handle them when you're on a team. So I would recommend them. I think their next Agile MBA starts in May, if I'm not mistaken. Let's go look. So the Agile MBA, let's see if they have a someplace. Oh, the calendar. Here we go. The next Agile MBA starts when? Haha, I have to talk to them. It's not on their calendar, but I'm pretty sure it's in May. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Inflam We Trust. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll talk to Edward Gordon, who's uh, their I guess CEO about this. I think that's something he's probably that he's obviously missed. I actually have a meeting with him this week. So another important thing is practice all the Scrum events. Again, you don't have to have a separate meeting for every Scrum event. I mean, that's the ideal case, but we know that it's really hard to coordinate meetings when Voyagers have family commitments that chances are you've got a job or university studies or whatever you're doing. It's just the Voyage is a big demand on your time. So you can have a single meeting where you combine those. And one of the things we've suggested since we started using Scrum was that if you can only have one meeting a week, make that your sprint planning meeting on a Monday, but devote the first 15 minutes to the review of the prior sprint, the next 15 minutes to a sprint retrospective where you look at how can you improve as a team, and then finally do your sprint planning. Also, rely on your product owner and scrum master for guidance. We are really lucky. We've been really pushing hard to get more product owners and scrum masters, and we now have enough that we will at least have a scrum master for every team, and we have almost enough product owners for every team. And they are essentially experts in Scrum. Uh, the product owners and Scrum masters that are in Voyage teams, there are two varieties. There's a primary. Those folks, they are certified or they have been trained. And most likely they've gone through one Voyage shadowing another Scrum Master or product owner, which is is the other type of PO or Scrum Master you may see on a team. You may see a shadow who are learning from the primary product owner or Scrum Master, and they're a little bit more passive than a normal team member. Uh, yeah, I agree, Snowbites. That retrospective is the part of Scrum that I actually I find the most valuable. Now, that's not to say skip all the other Scrum events and parts of Scrum, but that retrospective is the way that your team will improve sprint after sprint after sprint. Yeah, and when you're following Scrum, that means you're going to be able to embrace change and adapt to it. Uh, Scrum is a framework. It is a framework built on top of the agile methodology, just like extreme programming and test-driven development are. Those are both agile frameworks built on top of the agile methodology. Uh, but when you're following Scrum, when change occurs, it's easier to resolve that change without a lot of the emotion and the hassle and the elevated stress that we see in other forms of project management, like waterfall. So, any questions or thoughts or disagreements for that matter? You may not realize it, but I am not perfect. This is where Dinesh and Andres are going to jump in with both feet, and not Corey as well. Okay, so we're coming to the end. This is the last slide. If you're doing all of these things, what's the end state? What's our goal we're trying to reach? So really what you're wanting is your team should develop a common mindset. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone thinks alike or has the same opinions. It means that you agree on the strategy that you're going to follow, and you agree on the attributes that you're going to show or you're going to exhibit to your teammates. So a team mindset is one where everyone on the team has this shared product vision. Okay. You've defined that vision up front, and everyone is working to contribute to realizing what that vision is. There's also shared commitment. No one on the team is going to be, for lack of a better word, slacking off. Everyone on the team is giving 100% to reaching the goal. And in the process of doing that, they're doing things like sharing what they've learned with their teammates. They're contributing ideas. They're doing PR reviews. They're basically investing their time in the project. And obviously, developers are going to be coding, and UI UX people are going to be working on the design. Oh, thank you, Doris. I appreciate that. Again, we touched on this, but a team mindset is a direction where everyone is supporting their teammates. And the reason for that is teams are going to win together or they're going to lose together. There are no individual winners or losers in a team. It's all about the team. And I guess I could be accused of, oh, well, this sounds like communism or whatever. But it really is true that the best teams are ones that are united with one another, and they're all working in the same direction. Yeah, very true. Dream work. Teamwork is dream work. The other thing to keep in mind is you're at Chingu because you are most likely at the beginning stages of your career. So you're learning the technology, you're learning the responsibilities and the aspects of your individual roles. But we don't accept or we don't require perfection. None of us are perfect. And to gain mastery in something, this is actually an old adage, but mastery requires doing something 10,000 times. So don't be afraid to make mistakes as long as you're learning from mistakes. And in fact, for your team retrospectives, some of the best topics to put on the agenda are the mistakes that have happened in the prior sprint or the current sprint. What are those mistakes? And you ask, the questions. Why did they occur? How can we prevent them? And how can we leverage, how can we use what we learned from those mistakes? So that's all that I had prepared for today. Uh, I hope you found this useful. I want to open this up now to any question, any thoughts, any criticisms or problems on any topic, not just this. We Voyage 55 is going to start on May the 5th. The solo project is due by midnight in your local time zone on Sunday, April 27th. So if you're interested in joining the voyage, why make sure your solo project gets in. And as part of the feedback, when your solo project passes, your evaluator will provide you with the link to the voyage sign-up sheet or sign-up form. Oh, thank you, Eigel. So I'm just pausing to see. I know people are typing, and before we close out, I want to make sure we answer any questions anyone has. Okay, so let's see. Teams would. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, so let's go ahead. We'll give you the rest of your weekend back. Uh, it's always good. I say this on every Saturday, but it's really true. You can't take care of anything else if you're not taking care of yourself. So make sure that you're not just reading documentation and coding all weekend long. Take a little time for yourself to relax and do something else. Uh, Now, I know that's tough for you, Dinesh, because you have a release coming up next Friday for your work. But if at all possible, like I said, don't assume that you're being selfish if you're doing something for yourself. So, with that, thank you. And again, I'll we recorded this, so I will post it on YouTube later today, and we'll give you a link to that in the Pound Announcements channel. So thanks a lot, and everyone have a good weekend. Bye bye.